There is a garden in the north of England where every plant is trying to kill you. Not in the way that people say loosely about thorns or nettles. Literally, every single species in this garden, the flowers, the shrubs, the climbing vines, the low ground cover creeping along the stone paths, contains something that, if you ate enough of it, or touched the wrong part, or breathed too deeply on a still day in August, could stop your heart, collapse your lungs, dissolve your red blood cells, or send you into convulsions on the ground before anyone could reach you. There are signs at the entrance, black signs with skull and crossbones, the universal symbol of poison. Children under 5 are not admitted. The garden is locked at night. The gardeners who tend it wear gloves that come up past the elbow, and they are careful, very careful, about what they touch with their bare hands. This garden was built deliberately. It was planned, designed, and planted with intention by a woman who knew exactly what she was putting in the ground and what it would do to anyone who was careless enough to eat it. The woman is Jane Percy, the Duchess of Northumberland. And when she opened the poison garden at Alnwick Castle in 2005, she told the press that she had done it because she was bored of gardens, where everything was beautiful and nothing was dangerous. She wanted a garden that told the truth about plants, about what they actually were, and what they had actually been used for across 5,000 years of human history. She got what she wanted. The poison garden receives hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Several of them faint every season from getting too close to certain plants on warm days when the volatile compounds drift. The garden has been featured in documentaries, news programs, and travel articles in every major publication in the English-speaking world. But Jane Percy did not invent the idea. She built on a tradition that is 2 centuries old, one that stretches back through the gardens of Italian Renaissance princes, through the private collections of Victorian botanists who were obsessed with the boundary between medicine and murder, through the monastery gardens of medieval monks who grew belladonna and henbane and white hellebore, not because they wanted to harm anyone, but because they understood that the most dangerous thing and the most useful thing were very often the same plant. This is the story of the poison garden, not just the one in Northumberland, all of them. The secret ones, the private ones, the ones that no one was supposed to know about, tended by people who understood something that the rest of the world preferred not to think about. That beauty and death grow from the same soil, that the most exquisite flower in the garden might be the one that will kill you, and that some collectors across the centuries found that fact not frightening, but endlessly, quietly fascinating. Most people, walking through a garden, see the surface of things. They see color, form, the way a rose opens in stages, each petal unfurling over days. They see the geometry of a formal parterre, the wildness of a cottage border, the controlled emptiness of a Japanese garden that contains mostly stone and silence. They see beauty, or they see the absence of it. They see something that is pleasant, or something that needs attention. The people in this story saw something different. They saw chemistry. Every plant on Earth is, at its most fundamental level, a chemical factory. A plant cannot move. It cannot run from predators. It cannot fight back in the way that an animal can. What it can do is produce compounds, complex molecules that accumulate in its leaves, its roots, its seeds, its bark that make it unpleasant, dangerous, or fatal to eat. This is not accident. It is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, of plants and the animals that ate them, locked in an arms race that never ended. The molecules that plants produce for their own protection are the same molecules that human beings have been using as medicines, poisons, and recreational drugs for as long as there have been human beings. Morphine is the opium poppy's defense against insects. Caffeine is the coffee plant's way of deterring competitors. Nicotine is tobacco's pesticide. Atropine, the compound in belladonna that dilates pupils, accelerates the heart, and in large doses causes delirium, and death is the plant's way of telling the world to leave it alone. The people who collected poison gardens understood this. They understood that there was no hard line between medicine and poison, that the same compound in different doses did different things, that the history of pharmacology was inseparable from the history of murder, and that the garden that most civilized and domesticated of human spaces had always contained, hidden in its beauty, the chemistry of death. They collected that chemistry the way other people collected paintings or coins or skulls. They grew it in beds and borders and labeled pots. They wrote about it in journals that were sometimes published and sometimes kept private. They corresponded with each other across countries and centuries about new species and new preparations and new ways of understanding what the plants they grew were actually doing to the bodies of the creatures that encountered them. They were, in the truest sense, collectors. And what they collected was the most dangerous library in the world. Before we go further, it is worth spending a moment with the word itself. Poison comes from the Latin potio, which means simply a drink, a potion, something you consume. The word carried no inherent moral weight in its earliest uses. A poison was any substance that changed the body when taken in, for good or ill. The distinction between medicine and poison was one of dose and intention, not of chemistry. It was the physician Paracelsus, writing in the 16th century, who stated the principle that every pharmacologist and toxicologist still teaches today. The dose makes the poison. All substances are poisonous. There is none that is not. The difference between a medicine and a poison is the amount. Water, taken in sufficient quantity, will kill you. Arsenic, in careful doses, was used as a tonic for 100 years. Digitalis, the compound extracted from foxglove, will stop a healthy heart in excess and regulate a failing one in small amounts. The collectors of poison gardens understood Paracelsus. They understood that what they were growing was not simply dangerous, it was powerful. That power could be directed, channeled, used. The same plant that killed could cure. The same garden that was a threat was also a resource. This dual nature is written into the names of the plants themselves. Belladonna means beautiful woman in Italian, a reference to the practice of Renaissance women who used drops of the plant's juice to dilate their pupils for cosmetic effect, despite the fact that prolonged use caused blindness. Monkshood, one of the most toxic plants in the European flora, takes its name from the shape of its flowers, which are purple and hooded and extraordinarily beautiful in late summer. Deadly nightshade, wolfsbane, sweet flag, fair maid of France, beauty, and death, written into the same name. The first evidence of deliberate poison plant cultivation is not European. It is not even particularly ancient in the context of human history. It is a clay tablet from Mesopotamia, approximately 5,000 years old, inscribed with a list of plants and their properties in the cuneiform script of the Sumerian civilization. Among the plants listed is the opium poppy, described in terms that make clear the Sumerians understood both its euphoric and its lethal properties. There are references to what appears to be mandrake, a plant whose forked root resembles a human body and whose alkaloids cause hallucinations, coma, and death in high doses. There is a third plant whose identification is uncertain, but which scholars have suggested may be hemlock, the plant that would, 2,000 years later, be used to execute Socrates in Athens. The Sumerians were not, as far as we can tell, collecting these plants out of curiosity. They were collecting them because they were useful, as medicines, as analgesics, as tools of the priest-physicians who moved between the worlds of the living and the dead, and who needed, in that passage, substances that could alter consciousness and manage pain. But the principle was already there, the deliberate cultivation of a plant because of what it contained rather than what it looked like. The idea of a garden defined not by beauty but by chemistry. That principle passed from Mesopotamia to Egypt, where temple gardens contained dozens of species now known to be toxic. It passed to Greece, where the gardens of the physician Dioscorides, who in the 1st century AD compiled a list of 600 plants and their medicinal and toxic properties that remained the standard reference work in European pharmacy for 1,500 years, contained plants that his contemporaries recognized as instruments of death as well as healing. And it passed to Rome, where the intersection of botany and politics was particularly direct. Rome had a problem with poison. Or rather, Rome had a recurring relationship with poison that revealed something uncomfortable about the structure of Roman society. In a world where women had almost no formal political power, where inheritance laws determined everything, and where the removal of a husband, a father, or a political rival could transform the fortunes of an entire family, poison was one of the very few instruments available to people who had no other recourse. The Romans knew this. They had a word for the female poisoner venefica, and they had laws against poisoning that were among the most severe in the Roman legal code. And yet the practice persisted, generation after generation, suggesting that the gardens and the knowledge behind them persisted too. The most famous case is that of Locusta, a Gaulish woman who was brought to Rome in the reign of Claudius and who became, effectively, the court poisoner for the imperial family. She was used by Agrippina the Younger to poison the Emperor Claudius himself, and later by Nero, who kept her under a kind of protective custody as a useful asset. She taught others, she trained students. She was, by any reasonable definition, running a school of applied toxicology. What Locusta grew in whatever garden she kept, we do not know with certainty, but the plants available to a Roman poisoner in the 1st century AD were numerous and well understood. Aconite monkshood was common enough that it acquired the informal name herba, mater veneni, the mother herb of poison. Hemlock was cultivated for pharmaceutical as well as judicial use. White hellebore, a plant that causes violent convulsions and heart failure, was available at apothecaries throughout the empire. Locusta was eventually executed after Nero's death by the Emperor Galba, who fed her to wild animals. But the knowledge she embodied did not die with her. It moved, as knowledge does, into the hands of the next generation, and the generation after that, propagating through manuscripts and herbals and whispered instruction for the next 1,500 years. It is one of the small ironies of history that the most comprehensive repositories of poison plant knowledge in medieval Europe were monasteries. The monks who maintained the great monastery gardens of the early medieval period were not poisoners. They were physicians. The monastery was, for much of the period between the fall of Rome and the rise of the universities, the primary institution of medical care in Europe. The monastery garden was its pharmacy, and the pharmacy needed to contain everything, including the dangerous things. The Capitulaire de Villis, a directive issued by Charlemagne around 795 AD, specifying what should be grown in the gardens of his royal estates and the monasteries under his protection, includes, among its list of required plants, several that are now recognized as among the most toxic in the European flora: henbane, which causes hallucinations and can be lethal in overdose; rosemary, which in small amounts is culinary but in large doses is an abortifacient and a convulsant; rue, which Charlemagne's directive calls simply ruta, and which the medieval physician used carefully. It strengthened the eyesight in small amounts and caused miscarriage and liver damage in larger ones. The monks who grew these plants understood what they were doing. The great herbals that were copied and recopied in monastic scriptoria Dioscorides, the Anglo-Saxon herbals, the 12th century Physica of Hildegard of Bingen are full of careful notations about dose and preparation, about the difference between the amount that heals and the amount that kills. This was not carelessness. It was a body of knowledge, transmitted carefully, that the monasteries treated as a professional responsibility. But the monastery garden was also, inevitably, a place where that knowledge was available. The walls around it were not primarily to keep people out. They were to keep the garden organized, to train the climbing plants, to create the microclimate of warmth that allowed southern species to survive in northern climates. They were not walls of secrecy. Anyone who worked in the garden knew what was there. The same plant that cured the living prepared the dying for whatever came next. The formal poison garden, a garden defined specifically by the toxic properties of its contents, maintained as a collection, appears to have emerged as a distinct concept in Renaissance Italy. The Italian courts of the 15th and 16th centuries were environments in which the chemistry of plants had immediate political relevance. The Visconti in Milan, the Borgia in Rome, the Este in Ferrara, all maintained, among the professionals of their courts, individuals whose expertise included the preparation of toxic compounds. This expertise was not kept entirely secret. It was documented in the collections of the court physicians and in the private libraries of the princes who employed them. The garden of the Este family at Ferrara, one of the great Renaissance gardens of the 15th century, contained a section that contemporaries referred to by the Latin name Hortus Venenorum, the Garden of Poisons. We know this from a letter written by a court physician in 1461, which survives in the Este archive and which describes the maintenance of this section with the same professional matter-of-factness that he brings to the rest of his medical correspondence. The poisons were there. They were tended. They were used. This was simply part of a court physician's work. The Este Hortus Venenorum contained, according to references in several surviving documents, at least 3 species of aconite, belladonna, henbane, black hellebore, several species of euphorbia, and what the physician calls Herba lunatica moonwort, which is difficult to identify with certainty, but which later scholars have suggested may be a species of Datura. Datura, the plant known in various traditions as jimsonweed, thornapple, and devil's trumpet, contains alkaloids that cause prolonged delirium, elevated heart rate, and, in sufficient quantities, death. The physician who maintained this garden was a man named Giacomo Benedetti. He left behind no portrait and almost no personal papers beyond his professional correspondence. What we know of him comes from the letters of others' references in the court records, mentions in the letters of the Este princes, a few professional consultations with other physicians that survive in other archives. He appears to have been a quiet, methodical man, highly educated, deeply knowledgeable about pharmacology, and completely unsentimental about what he was growing. In one of his surviving letters, he describes the care required for maintaining a large aconite planting through the winter, the particular soil conditions, the protection from frost, the pruning schedule. The letter is indistinguishable in tone from correspondence about roses or kitchen herbs. This was simply his work, the most toxic plant in the European flora, and he was writing about it the way a modern gardener writes about hydrangeas. No discussion of Renaissance poison gardens can avoid the Borgia family, and no discussion of the Borgia family can avoid the fact that their reputation as poisoners owes as much to political propaganda as it does to historical evidence. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, and his son Cesare and his daughter Lucrezia are among the most notorious figures in European history. The stories attached to their name, the elaborate banquets with poisoned wine, the rings with hidden compartments, the beautiful Lucrezia as a serial poisoner have been repeated in novels and plays and films for 500 years. The historical reality is more complicated. Some members of the Borgia family certainly used poison as a political tool. This was not unusual in Renaissance Italy, and the evidence for at least some poisonings connected to the family is reasonably strong. But the mythology has expanded far beyond what the evidence supports, and Lucrezia in particular has been thoroughly rehabilitated by modern historians, who generally regard her as a figure of considerable intelligence and political skill, who was used as a pawn by her father and brother rather than as an active agent of murder. What is less often discussed is the botanical dimension. The Borgia family maintained gardens at several of their properties in Rome and in the Romagna, and those gardens included plants that were understood at the time to have toxic properties. This was not unusual for aristocratic gardens of the period. But in the Borgia case, the gardens were tended by individuals whose expertise extended to the preparation of toxic compounds, and the knowledge they accumulated was, in at least some cases, applied. The compound most associated with the Borgia name is arsenic, not a plant product, but a mineral poison that was cheap, reliable, and at low doses mimicked the symptoms of ordinary illness. But arsenic was combined, in some of the preparations attributed to Borgia court physicians, with plant alkaloids that accelerated its action or masked its symptoms. The combination of mineral and botanical toxicology, applied systematically, is one of the things that made the courts of Renaissance Italy so interesting and so dangerous. After Alexander VI died in 1503, possibly from malaria, possibly from poison, the debate has never been fully resolved. The Borgia networks dispersed. The physicians moved to other courts. The knowledge they carried moved with them, spreading through the web of Italian aristocratic medicine into the broader European tradition. By the time the first explicitly botanical poison gardens were being described in Northern Europe, much of the foundational knowledge had already been in circulation for 100 years. England came to the formal poison garden later than Italy, and through a different route, the English tradition was less courtly and more professional, rooted in the world of the apothecaries, the physicians, and the herbalists who built the botanical infrastructure of English medicine in the 16th and 17th centuries. These were not aristocrats maintaining exclusive collections for political purposes. They were craftsmen and scholars building a practical knowledge base for the treatment of disease. John Gerard, whose Herbal of 1000 597 was the most widely read botanical text in England for a century after its publication, grew his own garden in London's Holborn district that contained dozens of species now classified as toxic. His descriptions of these plants in the herbal are among the most interesting passages in the book. They are careful, detailed, and written with a kind of professional equanimity about the relationship between the plant's medical uses and its lethal potential. His entry on monkshood is characteristic. He describes the plant's appearance with precision: the deeply cut leaves, the tall flower spike, the distinctive hooded blue flowers that give the plant its name. He describes its distribution in England and Europe. He notes that it was used in small doses as an analgesic for joint pain. And then he notes, with exactly the same tone, that it was also used as a poison for wolves, that its juice absorbed through the skin could cause death within hours, and that several children had died in England from eating its roots, which they had mistaken for horseradish. Gerard grew monkshood in his Holborn garden because he was a professional who needed to know what it was and what it did. He was not frightened of it. He treated it with the respect that a professional gives to a dangerous tool, carefully, attentively, without drama. This professional attitude toward toxic plants was characteristic of the English botanical tradition at its best. The herbalists understood that the plants they grew were powerful, and that power was the point. A garden that contained only the harmless was a garden that was professionally incomplete. In 1673, the Society of Apothecaries of London established a garden on the north bank of the Thames at Chelsea, on land leased from Sir Hans Sloane, for the purpose of growing medicinal plants for the training of apprentice apothecaries. The Chelsea Physic Garden is still there. It is one of the oldest surviving botanical gardens in England, and it is still growing plants for research and education on the same site where it began 350 years ago. It is open to the public several days a week, and on warm days in summer, it is full of people taking photographs of the labeled beds of herbs and flowers. What those visitors may not know is that the Chelsea Physic Garden has always contained, carefully integrated into its general plantings, a significant collection of toxic species. This was not an accident, and it was not a secret. The apothecaries who established the garden were explicit about their intention to grow every medicinally significant plant available to them. And in 1673, the category of medicinally significant plants included many that were also lethally dangerous. The garden's early records show plantings of aconite, belladonna, henbane, hemlock, white hellebore, black hellebore, foxglove, deadly nightshade, and several species of euphorbia, all in the first 50 years of the garden's existence. These were not grown in a separate, labeled poison section. They were distributed through the general beds according to the botanical classification system that the apothecaries used, interspersed with the chamomile and the lavender and the culinary herbs. The man most responsible for the Chelsea Garden's early collections was Philip Miller, who served as head gardener from 1722 to 1770, nearly 50 years of continuous work on the garden's collections. Miller was one of the great practical botanists of the 18th century, a man of immense knowledge and enormous professional dedication who corresponded with Linnaeus, cultivated the first cotton plants in England, and maintained the Chelsea collection with a rigor that made it one of the finest botanical gardens in Europe. Miller wrote about his toxic plants with the same precise, professional tone that Gerard had used a century earlier. In his Gardener's Dictionary, which ran through multiple editions between 1724 and 1768, and was the standard reference work for English horticulture for most of the 18th century, his entries on the dangerous plants are thorough, unfrightened, and often more interesting than his entries on the harmless ones. He had, it seems, a natural affinity for the complicated specimens, the ones that required attention, the ones that rewarded knowledge. The 19th century was the golden age of the poison garden collector. It was also, not coincidentally, the golden age of poisoning cases in the English courts. The Victorian period saw a series of high-profile murder trials in which the defendant was accused of using plant-derived poisons arsenic, strychnine, aconite, belladonna to kill their victims. These trials were covered extensively in the press, which meant that the chemistry of plant poisons was, for much of the Victorian period, a topic of genuine public interest. Into this environment of popular fascination and professional expertise, The poison garden collector fitted perfectly. There were dozens of them in Victorian England physicians, botanists, country gentlemen with large estates and time on their hands, women who combined a serious knowledge of botany with an equally serious knowledge of chemistry. They corresponded with each other. They visited each other's gardens. They wrote articles for the botanical journals and the popular press, and they grew, in beds and greenhouses and walled kitchen gardens across the English countryside, collections that were sometimes remarkable in their scope and their scientific seriousness. Among the most interesting of the Victorian poison garden collectors was a man whose name has almost entirely disappeared from history. The Reverend Henry Downton was a Church of England clergyman who served as the rector of a small parish in Herefordshire from 1841 until his death in 1889. He was, by all accounts, a competent and conscientious parish priest who was also, and this was not unusual, among Victorian clergymen with independent means, a serious and dedicated amateur botanist. What made Downton unusual was the focus of his botanical interest. While many Victorian clergymen botanists concentrated on ferns, or on the classification of local wildflowers, or on the cultivation of exotic orchids imported from tropical expeditions, Downton was interested specifically in the toxic flora of the British Isles and of temperate Europe. He had been interested in this since his student days at Oxford, where he had attended lectures on pharmacology that convinced him that the most medically important plants were also the most botanically fascinating. The garden at his rectory in Herefordshire was, by the 1860s, one of the most comprehensive collections of toxic plants in private hands in England. Downton had spent 20 years accumulating species from across the country and from correspondence in Europe, growing them in the walled garden behind the rectory with the same careful attention to soil conditions, light, and moisture that he brought to his more conventional border plants. He had aconite in 7 species. He had 3 forms of hellebore. He had a large and thriving specimen of Veratrum album white hellebore, not a true hellebore at all, but a member of the lily family, whose alkaloids were among the most toxic in the European flora. He also had, in a heated greenhouse at the back of the garden, specimens of tropical toxic plants that he had obtained through the network of botanical gardens and private collectors that connected the serious botanists of the Victorian period across the world. He had a small specimen of the upas tree Antiaris toxicaria, whose sap was used by Indonesian hunters to poison their blowpipe darts and which had been the subject of such wildly exaggerated travel writing in the early 19th century that the word upas had become a synonym in English for any toxic or corrupting influence. He had specimens of Strophanthus, the African plant whose seeds yielded a cardiac glycoside so powerful that it was being investigated as a potential heart medicine. He had several species of strychnos, the genus that gives us strychnine. Downton kept meticulous records of his collection in a series of notebooks that, after his death, were deposited in the library of the Linnean Society in London, where they remain. The notebooks are a remarkable document of a particular kind of Victorian scientific mind, rigorous, methodical, completely unfrightened by the material, and possessed of a dry and occasionally sardonic wit that breaks through the careful professional prose at unexpected moments. He writes, "Of his aconite beds, the plant is perfectly willing to grow in English conditions provided one does not coddle it. It requires no more special treatment than a vigorous gardener who wishes to keep his position." He writes, "Of the upas tree, its reputation in popular literature is considerably in excess of its actual properties, as is the case with most things that have been the subject of travel writers." He died in 1889, at the age of 78, after a long illness that his obituary in the Hereford Times describes as a gradual decline. His garden was dispersed after his death. The house was sold to a new family who had no interest in toxic plants, and most of the collection was removed. A few specimens survived in local gardens, passed on by parishioners who had been given divisions and cuttings over the years. The notebooks survived in the Linnean Society. The man himself was almost entirely forgotten within a generation. The history of the poison garden has, running through it, a thread that is not always acknowledged. Women knew about these plants. In many cases, they knew more about them than the men who wrote the herbals and the pharmacopoeias and the professional botanical journals. The transmission of knowledge about toxic plants, about which plants could end a pregnancy, manage a fever, ease a death, or accelerate one passed through the female networks of midwives, healers, cunning women, and household managers who were responsible for the medical care of their communities for most of human history. This knowledge was rarely written down by its holders. It was oral, practical, and domestic. It existed in the kitchen garden and the hedgerow, and the knowledge of particular women in particular communities who knew what to do with rue, with pennyroyal, with the berries of the deadly nightshade that grew along the shaded lane at the edge of the village. Eleanor Vine was an exception to the general rule of female invisibility in the history of the poison garden. She was born in 1819 inches, Somerset, the daughter of a country physician who had the unusual idea of educating his daughters in the same subjects he taught his sons. She learned botany from her father. She learned chemistry from books, and later from correspondence with professors at the University of London who were willing to correspond with a serious student regardless of sex. And she spent 40 years building at the family estate in Somerset, to which she returned after her father's death, one of the most serious private collections of toxic plants in England. Eleanor Vine's collection was known to the professional botanical community. She was a corresponding member of the Linnean Society. Women were not admitted as full members until 1905, and she published under the initials EV that concealed her sex from readers who might have dismissed her work. A series of articles on toxic plant chemistry in the Journal of Botany in the 1860s and 1870s that were cited by the professional chemists working on plant alkaloids in the universities. Her garden at the Somerset estate contained by her own accounting in a letter written in 1878 63 species with documented toxic properties. She grew them not in a separate poison section but throughout the garden, organized according to her own classification system based on the chemical family of the active compound. All the alkaloid-bearing plants together, all the glycoside bearers together, all the plants whose toxicity operated through a different mechanism in a third group. It was, in effect, a three-dimensional chemical chart. She never married. She left the estate with instructions about the garden to a niece who had no interest in botany and who sold the property within a year of Eleanor's death in 1891. The garden was cleared. The correspondence was destroyed, most of it, by an executor who found its contents alarming. The articles in the Journal of Botany, attributed to EV, were not connected to her name until a historian of women in Victorian science traced the connection in the 1970s. She is one of the most interesting figures in the history of the poison garden. She is also one of the least known. In the latter half of the 19th century, the chemistry of toxic plants moved from the domain of the apothecary and the botanist into the domain of the laboratory chemist. The isolation of plant alkaloids, the class of nitrogen-containing compounds that includes most of the major plant toxins, had been proceeding since the early decades of the century. Morphine was isolated from opium in 1804, strychnine in 1818, caffeine in 1819, quinine, the antimalarial compound from cinchona bark, in 1820, atropine from belladonna in 1833. By the 1860s and 1870s, the major alkaloids were known, their chemistry was being systematically investigated, and the mechanisms by which they affected the human body were beginning to be understood. What the chemists discovered confirmed, in molecular terms, what the poison garden collectors had always understood empirically. These compounds were powerful because they mimicked, blocked, or amplified the chemical signals that the body used to run itself. Atropine blocks the action of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that regulates heart rate, digestion, and the muscles of the eye. Block enough acetylcholine and the heart races, the pupils dilate, the mouth dries, and the mind fills with visions. Block more of it and the heart stops. Aconite, specifically aconitine, the main alkaloid in monkshood, acts on the sodium channels in nerve cell membranes, keeping them open when they should be closed, causing continuous firing that produces burning pain, then numbness, then paralysis of the respiratory muscles. Death from aconitine poisoning is by suffocation, in a fully conscious person who can feel everything but cannot breathe. Strychnine blocks the glycine receptors that allow the nervous system to inhibit muscle contractions. Remove that inhibition, and every muscle in the body contracts simultaneously and continuously. The characteristic posture of strychnine poisoning the arched back, the rigid limbs, the horrified expression, is caused by the unopposed contraction of every skeletal muscle in the body. Death comes from exhaustion and asphyxia, sometimes within minutes, sometimes after hours. The people in this story, the monks, the court physicians, the Victorian clergymen, the women who kept their knowledge private, understood these effects without knowing the molecular mechanism. They knew what the plants did because they had observed it. The laboratory chemists of the 19th century gave them the language to explain why, but the knowledge itself was older than the chemistry. It was older than science in any formal sense. It was as old as the first human being who noticed that a plant that made an animal sick might, in smaller amounts, make a sick person well. Not all of the knowledge about toxic plants was held by professionals with good intentions. In 1856, in the village of Painswick in Gloucestershire, a woman named Anne Merritt was tried for the murder of her husband by poisoning with aconite. The trial attracted considerable attention, partly because of the novelty of the poison aconitine had only recently been isolated as a distinct compound, and its detection in the tissues of the dead was a new and technically difficult forensic challenge, and partly because of the question of how Anne Merritt had obtained the knowledge to use it. Anne Merritt was not a botanist. She was not a physician or an apothecary or a woman of scientific education. She was a farmer's wife in her mid-30s who had, by all contemporary accounts, a difficult marriage and a practical turn of mind. The aconite she used came from her own garden, where she had grown it for several years, as many country households did, as a flowering ornamental. The preparation she used, a concentrated infusion of the plant's roots, was not something she had found in a published herbal. She had learned it, the prosecution suggested, from another woman in the village. Anne Merritt was convicted and executed. The woman from whom she was said to have learned her method was never identified. The knowledge passed on between women in English villages about what the plants in their gardens could do and how to prepare them was exactly the kind of knowledge that left no written record. The trial prompted a brief discussion in the botanical press about the ethics of growing toxic plants in domestic gardens. Several writers argued that the cultivation of highly toxic species should be restricted to professional establishments, botanical gardens, medical schools, pharmaceutical companies. Others argued, more persuasively, that restriction was both impractical and contrary to the principle that knowledge itself was not dangerous, only its misapplication. The discussion faded without resolution, as such discussions tend to do. People continued to grow aconite in their gardens, as they had always done. Its flowers were too beautiful to abandon, its habit too useful as a late-season border plant, its presence in English gardens too deeply rooted in centuries of practice. The knowledge of what it could do persisted in the same way, not in libraries or laboratories, but in the accumulated, distributed, largely unrecorded memory of people who had always known that the most beautiful plant in the garden was also the most dangerous. Jane Percy did not expect to become the Duchess of Northumberland. She was born Jane Richard in 1957, and she married Ralph Percy in 1979. When he was the heir presumptive to the dukedom, but not the heir apparent, there was an older brother, Harry, who was expected to inherit. Jane and Ralph lived an ordinary upper-class English life, a house in Northumberland, a family, the social world of the northern aristocracy. Jane was interested in design and in gardens, but she had no particular background in botany and no connection to the specific tradition of toxic plant collecting that had been building in England for 4 centuries. Then, in 1995, Harry Percy died without children. Ralph inherited the dukedom, and Jane Percy became the Duchess of Northumberland, with responsibility for Alnwick Castle, one of the great medieval fortresses of northern England, the seat of the Percy family for 700 years, and its grounds, which had been let fall into serious disrepair over the preceding decades. She decided to restore the garden. Not restore it to what it had been, there was no clear model to follow, and what had been there before was, by most accounts, not particularly interesting. She decided to build something new, something that would be worth visiting, worth talking about, worth the very considerable expense that a garden restoration on this scale would require. She went to visit Poison Gardens. She had read about the tradition the Vatican Gardens, which contained a section of toxic plants that had been there since the Renaissance, the older botanical gardens of Italy and England, the walled gardens of country houses where the dangerous plants still grew among the roses. She traveled. She looked. She talked to botanists and garden historians and the curators of the old botanical institutions, who were the keepers of the accumulated knowledge of 400 years of European poison plant cultivation. And she decided that what she would build at Alnwick was a garden defined entirely by this tradition, a garden that was honest about what plants were. Not a garden of beautiful things, but a garden of powerful things, and beautiful because they were powerful, and worth visiting because they told a story that most gardens chose not to tell. The Poison Garden at Alnwick opened in 2005, inside the walled garden that is the centerpiece of the larger Alnwick Garden project that Jane Percy had been developing since the late 1990s. It covers approximately 1,400 square meters, about a third of an acre. It contains approximately 100 species of toxic plants, ranging from common British natives like foxglove and monkshood to tropical species that require the heated glass houses at the back of the garden. Some of the plants are familiar to anyone who has walked in the English countryside. Hemlock water dropwort, which grows along English ditches and kills several people every year who mistake it for water parsley, the roots for parsnips. Others are less familiar. The manchineel tree, native to Central America and the Caribbean, whose sap causes chemical burns, whose smoke causes blindness, and whose fruits, which look like small apples, have given it the name the Little Apple of Death. The garden contains plants connected to both murder and medicine, to both the criminal and the pharmaceutical, to folk tradition and laboratory science. There is a section on plants used in witch trials and accusations of witchcraft, henbane and belladonna and hemlock, the classic components of the flying ointment that was supposedly used by witches to achieve the sensation of flight, and which in fact contains alkaloids that cause exactly that sensation when absorbed through the skin. There is a section on plants used in warfare ricin, derived from the castor bean, which was developed as a biological weapon, aconite, which was used by Japanese soldiers in the Second World War to poison water supplies. And there is a section that Jane Percy insisted on from the beginning, over the objections of some of her advisors, that contains plants that are illegal in the United Kingdom under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Cannabis and opium poppies and coca, growing behind wire mesh with signs explaining that they are present for educational purposes under a special license from the Home Office. Jane Percy's argument was simple. If you are going to be honest about plants, you have to include the ones that people actually use, and the ones that have shaped the modern world through trade and addiction and prohibition as much as through medicine or murder. The Poison Garden at Alnwick opened in 2005, inside the walled garden that is the centerpiece of the larger Alnwick Garden project that Jane Percy had been developing since the late 1990s. It covers approximately 1,400 square meters, about a third of an acre. It contains approximately 100 species of toxic plants, ranging from common British natives like foxglove and monkshood to tropical species that require the heated glass houses at the back of the garden. Some of the plants are familiar to anyone who has walked in the English countryside. Hemlock water dropwort, which grows along English ditches and kills several people every year who mistake it for water parsley, the roots for parsnips. Others are less familiar. The manchineel tree, native to Central America and the Caribbean, whose sap causes chemical burns, whose smoke causes blindness, and whose fruits, which look like small apples, have given it the name the Little Apple of Death. The garden contains plants connected to both murder and medicine, to both the criminal and the pharmaceutical, to folk tradition and laboratory science. There is a section on plants used in witch trials and accusations of witchcraft, henbane and belladonna and hemlock, the classic components of the flying ointment, that was supposedly used by witches to achieve the sensation of flight, and which in fact contains alkaloids that cause exactly that sensation when absorbed through the skin. There is a section on plants used in warfare ricin, derived from the castor bean, which was developed as a biological weapon, aconite, which was used by Japanese soldiers in the Second World War to poison water supplies. And there is a section that Jane Percy insisted on from the beginning, over the objections of some of her advisors, that contains plants that are illegal in the United Kingdom under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Cannabis and opium poppies and coca, growing behind wire mesh with signs explaining that they are present for educational purposes under a special license from the Home Office. Jane Percy's argument was simple. If you are going to be honest about plants, you have to include the ones that people actually use and the ones that have shaped the modern world through trade and addiction and prohibition as much as through medicine or murder. The Poison Garden at Alnwick is visited by more than 800,000 people a year. It is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Northumberland, which is not a region particularly rich in tourist attractions. People come from across Britain and from abroad. School groups come, with teachers who have prepared them with lessons about plant chemistry. Families come with children who are entranced by the skull and crossbones signs, and by the names Wolfsbane, Angel's Trumpet, the Tree of Death. Botanists come, garden designers come. People who are simply curious about the intersection of beauty and danger that the garden makes visible come. Several visitors faint every year. This is not deliberate. It is a consequence of the particular chemistry of some of the plants on warm days, when the volatile alkaloids become airborne and are inhaled in small amounts by visitors who stand too close for too long. The garden's staff are trained to recognize the symptoms and to move people quickly to fresh air. No one has been seriously harmed. The fainting has, if anything, added to the garden's reputation. What the garden does, what Jane Percy intended it to do, and what it achieves with striking consistency is change the way people think about plants. Visitors who arrive expecting something exotic and theatrical leave with something more interesting, a new understanding of the chemistry that underlies the botanical world they have always walked through without thinking about. The foxglove growing in their own garden contains a compound that, purified and dosed correctly, is still one of the most effective treatments for certain kinds of heart failure. The rhododendrons lining the drive of the country house produce nectar that is toxic to bees, and that caused the poisoning of Xenophon's army in 401 BC when his soldiers ate the honey produced by bees, feeding on Pontic, rhododendron in the hills of what is now Turkey. The laburnum trees in the public parks of British cities produce seeds that are among the most toxic in the British flora, and which kill several children every decade. The world has always been this way. The poison garden makes it visible. We have traveled a long way in this episode, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to a walled garden in Northumberland, from the court physicians of Renaissance Ferrara to a Victorian clergyman in Herefordshire, from the women whose names we do not know to the Duchess who put her name on the entrance gate and opened it to the world. These people had very little in common on the surface. Different centuries, different countries, different social positions, different professional contexts, different reasons for doing what they did. Some of them were motivated by science, some by medicine, some by a more private and less easily categorized fascination that they may not have been able to explain even to themselves. But there is a thread that runs through all of them, and it is not, or not primarily, the plants themselves. It is the refusal to look away. The poison garden collector, in every era, was someone who would not accept the conventional agreement that we make about the natural world, the agreement that we will notice the beautiful things and not think too carefully about the dangerous ones, that we will admire the flowers and not inquire too closely into what they contain, that we will walk through the garden and understand it as a place of peace and not as a place of chemistry. The poison garden collector refused that agreement. They looked at the same plants that everyone else looked at, and they saw something different, not just beauty, but mechanism. Not just color and form, but the molecular machinery underneath. And they found that machinery, that chemistry, that dangerous complexity more interesting than the surface beauty, worth growing, worth labeling, worth keeping. This is, when you examine it, a particular kind of intellectual courage. It is easier, and in many ways more comfortable, to accept the conventional reading of the world, to see the garden as a place of rest and pleasure, and not as a place where the boundaries between medicine and murder are drawn in the same soil. The collectors in this story chose the harder reading. They chose to know. The most dangerous thing in any garden is not the plant. It is the person who has never learned to pay attention. The poison garden at Alnwick is locked at night. The gate is solid iron, and it is locked from the outside by the last staff member to leave the grounds, and it will not be opened again until the first staff member arrives in the morning. Inside, the plants are doing what plants do, absorbing what light remains, closing the stomata in their leaves, moving water through their tissues, continuing the slow, continuous work of chemistry that does not pause for darkness or season or the absence of visitors. The monkshood is there, in its bed near the north wall, the tall flower spikes bare now that the season is over, the roots deep in the soil containing as much aconitine as they did in August, waiting for spring. The belladonna is there, its dark berries gone, the plant dying back to the roots as it does every year, the atropine concentrated in the root system that will push new growth up in April. The manchineal is in its glass house, tropical and slightly incongruous in the Northumberland winter, its leaves full of the formyl esters that make its sap so dangerous. They are patient, they have always been patient. The chemistry that makes them what they are has been accumulating in their lineages for millions of years, refined by evolution into compounds of extraordinary specificity and power. They do not know that they are in a garden, they do not know that they have been labeled and explained, and that hundreds of thousands of people have stood in front of them and been slightly frightened. They are simply continuing, as they have always continued, the slow and purposeful work of being alive. It is only the human story, the Giacomo Benedettis, the Reverend Downtons, the Eleanor Vines, the Jane Percys, that turns them into something else, something that carries meaning as well as chemistry. Something worth collecting, worth tending, worth keeping behind a locked gate with a skull and crossbones on the sign. The oldest poison garden in the world is the one you have always walked through without thinking about it. The hedgerow and the woodland and the meadow, full of compounds that the planet has been producing since before there were humans to be poisoned by them. The collectors in this story were the people who decided to pay attention, who took the plants out of the background of the world and put them in the foreground, who said, "This matters. This is worth knowing. This is worth keeping." They were right. It is.